What's up, y'all? This is the Rising Tide Podcast. I'm your co-host, Dayton Du Bois, local comic, sometimes journalist, and I'm joined here with my other co-host,
Dale Smith.
Awesome. So let's introduce the show. So the Rising Tide Podcast is a collective attempt to platform working class politics in a media landscape dominated by corporations and corporate propaganda. Rising Tide is our reply to the present moment and represents our belief that working class politics are relevant and popular. It is our conviction that the working class needs a platform in order to oppose the corporate media that we see dominate and manufacture public opinion. These same media outlets try to manufacture consent for genocide and make excuses for rising poverty and exploitation. We are the rising tide that seeks to sweep away corporate bias and misdirection. So yeah, I think that's kind of like the nutshell of what this program is trying to accomplish. I think it might be useful just talking a little bit more about how we kind of fit into this and how we've come together to form this, Dale. I'm kind of curious if you want to share some of your thoughts into this.
Yeah, I've known Dayton for probably about like 8 years now, I would say.
Yeah, it's been that long.
Fortunately, unfortunately. Fortunately that we're friends and that we work together on stuff. Unfortunately, because things are the way they are today. I think we're seeing a lot of different issues in our society arise in different ways, and we're not really seeing the type of working class movement that we've seen historically that's able to stand up against it. And I think like our, perspective is by putting out different types of media to get people talking about this stuff, to bring different narratives into the fold, it can really, push back against a lot of what's out there already. We just known each other through doing political activism work together. I met Dayton when he worked at the Coalition on Homelessness. I was a member of the Democratic Socialists of America at the time. No longer a member. We're no longer doing that work together, but I'm glad that we still remain friends and comrades throughout that time, and have found ways to work together, and bring meaningful progressive politics into the fold. So, yeah.
At least we try to.
Yeah.
Well,
gotta try to do.
Well, I'm just trying to think of like what brought us to this particular moment. When I first met Dale and when I first became politically involved in the San Francisco Bay Area, a lot of it was around sort of responding to homelessness, right? That was a time of 2016 was a time of two things were going on. One was, the election of Donald Trump, Donald Trump's first administration. But specifically here for people trying to get involved in activism in San Francisco, a big thing was kind of responding to sort of like the criminalization of homelessness. It's like the criminalization of people in the street. That there are so many people in the street now, and then they're ultimately all getting fucked with the police, fucked with by the police, having their things taken. And sort of like working, initially I worked there as, as sort of a social worker and this one liberal nonprofit. And then you got connected with other organizers. Dale was one of them, and being involved with a lot of different things. So continuing that period of street activism in, homeless encampments and local, eventually getting into public housing and tenant organizing before we got sort of things deepened, the plot thickened when you think 2020 happened, and getting involved in a lot more of the street demonstrations that characterized George Floyd, being active in a lot of these so-called mutual aid programs that took place during the coronavirus pandemic. And, we could go on and on about all the different things we've worked on before that time and since then. But, fundamentally, one of the big things we learned about was that there's a need to really like have these basic platforms. That we've spent so many times like arguing and bickering with corporate journalists and corporate media that we really think that it's actually in working people's best interest that we tell our stories ourselves. Obviously, we're still going to, we still pay attention to the corporate media. We're still going to bring you all kinds of headlines from the corporate media. We still engage with that front. But, we ultimately got to do more than just that. So now we're going to introduce the program. So for the first episode of this show, what we're going to do is going to read off some headlines taken from the news cycle and some stories that we feel like should be a part of the news cycle, and they are not. And we're going to start with news local to the San Francisco Bay Area, and then expand outward to statewide, national, and then end on some international news stories. And so we're going to give you the facts first, and then we give you our analysis and what we don't think was covered in the original story, and where these stories were originally published elsewhere. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing we want end is or begin on is just share a little bit news that Dan Siegel, a longtime civil rights activist and civil rights attorney, passed away. He's joined the ancestors on July 2nd of this year. And so, Dan Siegel has been a longtime fixture in activism in the Bay Area and actually in the history of this country. Dan Siegel was a man who first became active during the Civil Rights Movement. He was a Jewish man from New York. He first became involved in the Civil Rights era organization, the CORE, right? So he was initially became involved with one of these youth acting as allies for the Black liberation struggle, right? And so then he ultimately came to UC Berkeley, and where he became the president of the student government during the time of the free speech movement. And he became a fixture in that movement, and ultimately he gained his first period of national prominence by his relationship to what's called the struggle for People's Park. So as part of the free speech movement, folks who aren't familiar, in Berkeley, California, the free speech movement, this really goes back to the struggle around the Vietnam War, that students on campuses were not allowed to actually talk about particular political topics. They were able to speak and discuss things, but not things of actual consequence. One of those particular was the U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. And so Dan Siegel at that time was a student activist who was very key in pointing the finger at the university's role in tamping down on dissent and really making that connection between the university and the war in Vietnam. And so his big, not I don't say his big claim to fame, but he gained national prominence when he gave a speech in Sproul Plaza in UC Berkeley, and he told students to go down and take the park. Coincidentally, the UC Berkeley administration cut his microphone right as he gave that statement. And so the crowd interpreted his statement. He claims, or he'll claim publicly, that statement wasn't necessarily meant to be taken literally. So basically, when the administration cut his microphone, the whole scene broke out into a riot, and then it produced several days of rioting, where the National Guard was called in, and People's Park was a community fixture for almost 53 years.
It's pretty ironic how that happens. They're trying to prevent something from happening, and by doing that, they end up enabling it.
Yeah, they make it happen crazy. And so, Dan Siegel, he had a long legal career as a civil rights lawyer in civil rights law, and I think he represented the Oakland mayor at one point, Mayor Kwan, a couple of mayor administrations ago. And yes, he passed recently, and so rest in power, Dan Siegel. I know, Dale, you have something to add to this.
Yeah, just rest in power, Dan. I didn't know him too well, but I definitely saw him a lot in activist spaces, and his name held a lot of weight for a good reason. He was somebody that was out there and continued to be out there, and that's definitely to be commended. I think oftentimes we might hear about people who might claim they were here in a certain place at a certain time, but then they stop doing that whenever they're done with college or that period of time. So it's definitely something to be said that he continued to stay involved in politics in ways that he felt was meaningful, and I think that's also just a reminder that, especially here in the Bay Area, there's still a lot of folks that did participate in these movements, and there's still a lot to learn from a lot of these folks. And it's important to, hear out their stories and hear what they have to say about that stuff. And also take it with a grain of salt, I definitely think a couple months ago, we went to an event that was held at a bookstore, where the takeaway that Dayton and I had from that was just that didn't really seem like it was worth our time, but that's not necessarily true most of the time, and I think it's, the only way you're going to figure that out is if you actually go out there and talk to people, go to these events, see what they're about, see what they're really pushing for, and hear their story. I think that's really, really important. Part of understanding history is understanding the people who are involved, and sometimes people call back to well, we just need to learn from people who did this in the past and our ancestors, and some of the people who did this stuff are still alive, and we can just try to talk to them or hear about their story, and then from that learn what we can from it and develop our own conclusions. I think that's really important. So yeah, definitely rest in power, Dan Siegel. 79 is still pretty young, even though it's our life expectancy is so-so in this society.
Yeah. All right, so I think we can actually start the program now. So let's just begin listing out what we're going to be covering today. Again, we're going to begin locally, and then we're going to start branching out. So our first story is in Alameda, the Alameda Native History Project dispels the myth of Lisjan. Then we've got natives of Fort McDermott fight lithium mining. The anti-ice resistance in the Bay and Los Angeles. Marines deployed. Nationwide No Kings protest, break records, but leave us wanting. And then in New York City, socialist Zohran Mamdani wins the DNC mayoral primary. National protests in Kenya against police murder, suppression of freedom of speech, and the Kenyan finance bill. Then we're moving back to Central America. State of emergency in Panama's western province. And then our final story, week of action in solidarity with Indian Maoist martyrs. All right. And so for our first story is a story that's actually pretty long overdue for anyone to be talking about. It has pretty, I think, serious ramifications for folks that are involved in a lot of, I would say, alternative or radical politics in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so far, I haven't found any local pages reporting on it outside of its original publishing, which is, I think, is pretty significant for a story of this significance, And so as for our own responsibility, I've been wanting to cover this story for some times, and a lot of different things got in the way, but like most Native people, we persist and we get that smoke signal out there. So let's get into it. So I had the pleasure to meet Gabriel Duncan last May. He's a really cool activist, artist, historian, and Native American steward. He's part of an organization called the Alameda Native History Project. And in their own words, they describe themselves as the Alameda Native History Project was founded in 2019 as an art project based on the history of the first Alamedans. And find the tribe that belongs to this place we now call Alameda. Over the past 6 years, we focused on research, education, and advocacy for the first Alamedans and the accurate representation of local indigenous history. So they do all kinds of stuff, soil making, acorn gathering. I had the interest to go to a couple of their workshops. We're actually going to be going to we're going to be building an acorn granary this fall. It's going to be really fun. He's a Paiute guy himself. I'm from the Mesa Grande Band, the Kumeyaay Nation. That's why I'm using these pronouns, us. So I'm just going to get into it. And so the work of the Alameda Native History Project is that their work is principally fought the erasure of Native people. Principally, it's the erasure of the Ohlone people. And, often this erasure has been taken on by the federal government and by a lot of opportunists trying to appropriate indigeneity to turn a profit. And so part of that work has meant educating people about First Peoples' histories and practices. I've talked a little bit about some of the work that they've done. And with these projects, we get to learn about how First Peoples have lived with the land, how they've worked together, and think of our own modern practices. But another key part of that is sort of setting the record straight and dispelling myths and uncovering the colonial project. And so I think the Alameda History Project recently made waves, or rather sort of spread a chill through the Bay Area radical politics by publishing an article titled Corrina Gould, The Myth of Lisjan and the Erosion of Tribal Sovereignty. We'll link the article in the description. And so for those who don't know, Corrina Gould, is the founder of the Segurate Land Trust. And she claims to be the tribal leader of a native nation called the Confederated Bands of Lisjan. And, they claim to be a nation of native people. And the piece that the Alameda Native History put out is very important because it tries to set the record straight about who are the first people of the Bay Area. And they directly criticize this idea of Lisjan as an identity. They really basically call this out as, this isn't a native nation. This is a nonprofit. It's an NGO. But what do they mean by that when they say that? Well, I think we got to ask, who are the first people of the Bay Area? Who are the Native Americans here, right? And so if you're you're from this area or you're familiar with the politics, you might be able to say, the Ohlone. The Ohlone are the first people who of the Bay Area. But that's kind of like saying, who lives in Oakland? Oaklanders. It's not very specifically. Mm-hmm. But specifically, when we say the first people of the Bay Area, who we're referring to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. Right, and so this is not the Segurate Land Trust. This isn't anything this is totally separate from this so-called Confederated Bands of Lisjan. And more importantly, this article puts forward the claim is that opportunists like the Segorte Land Trust have been trying to erase the Muwekma and profit off native representation in their place as an act of fraud, really. And so this piece details how the Segorte Land Trust misrepresents themselves to the public and profit off exploiting native politics. The Segorte Land Trust and Corrina Gould claim to represent a native nation of Ohlone people. And that's not true. They are a nonprofit. They are not a legal institute. They're not, they're not a community of people. They're not a trust, right, that carries on in perpetuity, right? They're a business, one type of business model, one type of tax unit, right? And so, in this, I think it's important. This is important to talk about because when we talk about the erasure of the Muwekma, when we say the modern colonization and erasure of Native people, this is like the product of that, because this is something that only Native people in this society have to deal with, right? Like Korean people don't have to deal with a group of Korean people pretending to have like a political party that represents people in South Korea that doesn't exist. Right? Like they don't have to do that, right? Because South Koreans have an independent society that has political power that can represent them, right? But often for indigenous people, Native American people, we lack that political sovereignty, right? There's no political, cultural, economic, social, political pole that can actually set the record straight, right? So when somebody claims to represent a Native nation, well, there's no parallel authority that can actually contradict that. And so I think, I just really wanted to read this one section about like why, this stuff matters, why like it actually matters, like, who's a nation and who's not. What's the difference between these two things? And so, from their own articles, they say that the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area is the only tribal government with documented continuity, legal standing, and ancestral responsibility for this land. The Muwekma are the living successors of the historic, federally recognized Verona Band of Alameda County. They descend from the indigenous people forced into the Mission San Jose de Guadalupe, Santa Clara de Tamian, and the San Francisco de Asís. Today, Muwekma has over 600 enrolled members. They have fought for their sovereignty, defended their sacred sites, and preserved their genealogy and governance through every wave of erasure, missions, courts, colonization, and nonprofits. And this is an important thing, it's for folks that I think important context. The Muwekma band, they used to be federally recognized the first hand of the 20th century, but that federal recognition was removed from them, I think, in the mid 1920s. What does that mean? It means that the federal government really is just trying to get rid of them, right? They're trying to get rid of them as an independent political entity, right? Because when they give them federal recognition, what they actually do is they also claim these people are they're entitled to certain things, right? They're entitled to a certain level of political and economic respect, right? Or there's certain obligations that the federal government has to them, right? And so they've been dealing with all different types of erasure. And so this particular episode right now is happening now is just one phase of a series of different attacks on them. But this isn't to say that people like Corrina Gould are not Ohlone people, right? This isn't anything like that. This isn't to say that the Segorte Land Trust doesn't have its own basis in any ideas that were common to the Ohlone people. No, it's not to say at all. She definitely is. But this organization is intentionally separate from any tribal government that represents Native people politically. And so the Segorte Land Trust, rather than representing a Native nation, represents a group of activists and individuals that may be partially Native, but it's still a liberal nonprofit. And this matters. It matters when people are rematriating land and money and resources to a liberal nonprofit versus a Native nation. Those are very different things. So I think the interesting thing, is the city of Berkeley is they've given land to the Segorte Land Trust under the idea of rematriating it back to Native peoples, but they're just donating it to a liberal nonprofit as a tax write-off. And then what happens when this NGO goes default, doesn't file its taxes correctly? Then some speculator buys it. Okay, then the rematriated land has been unmatriated back to the white man. It's ridiculous, right? So these things actually matter. It's not just an issue of just left-wing infighting, And so, the Segorte Land Trust, they solicit money, resource, and political support under the banner of supporting indigenous nations, but they erase the struggles of actual Native nations in the Bay Area. The Muwekma are trying to assert their land stewardship rights over areas like the Presidio in San Francisco right now. And they need a law of support right now. But the mainstream activist milieu is under the impression that they don't even exist, and they should just donate money to some liberal nonprofit. It's a fucking criminal. So check out the piece, learn more about Native people, and don't just throw money and support at some brown person. Look into what you're supporting. This is being done under the idea of strengthening our movement, but that requires accountability. Don't defraud people. Don't erase Native peoples. Don't be greedy, and then you have nothing to hide from people. It's fine. But anyway, Dale, what are some of your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, you covered a lot of really important points with that. And I do want to say, first off, it is pretty sad that there isn't more coverage on this particular subject, honestly, because I do think this is like a really important piece that came out and exposure. But people just aren't really talking about it. It kind of seems like it's gotten past that initial wave of the Segurite Land Trust getting a lot of criticism to the point where they would have to lock their Instagram posts, and now people are like back to, business as usual or whatever, which is pretty sad. I will say, like, as somebody who, started getting into more like left progressive activist spaces about like 8 years ago, this was my like first introduction to like, okay, what is like the indigenous movement like locally? And you would see a lot of people posting about this stuff. They would talk about saving the Shell Mound, in the East Bay. Shell Mound specifically was like a burial site that the Ohlone people would have, where they would, it would be like a combination of like, the carapaces of like shellfish, and then also like, people from their band or whatnot. And let's be frank, these sites were desecrated, at one period of time. Like some of the, quote unquote artifacts from those were just like displayed in the Emeryville Mall bathrooms. It's some pretty messed up stuff. But I think,
remember the campaign to save the shell mounds, they're a parking lot.
Yeah.
Right. The shell mounds are a parking lot.
Yeah, it was just they were going to take over a parking lot. But, me not knowing a whole lot, I was like, oh, yeah, this is important. But a big thing that this particular campaign and a lot of what they run on is, a lot of like white liberal guilt. And I do think it's important to be skeptical of political campaigns that are purely driven by guilt. People should understand it's like in their interest, not that they feel bad that something's happening. I mean, yeah, you should probably feel bad if some shit's happening, but it should go deeper than that. You should realize like, oh, it's more than me just feeling bad. I realize this affects me too, And like, I think a big part of it is like, they operate pretty heavily. Looks like Fred's making a cameo. They operate pretty heavily on, what they call this Shumi land tax, where essentially they solicit like regular donations. They have like a whole recommendation based on people's like tax bracket income, basically claiming like, like if you're a white person or a non-native person, like you should give us money. But it's like, this nonprofit is completely independent of the actual indigenous tribal band of the area that has this historical legacy, and it's a completely different thing if a band or group or community decides to make something like that, and it's a really difficult process, that people have to go through for self-determination. I even think like one point that's important to recognize is like even like self-determination as we see it in the United States for indigenous folks, it's an inherently flawed system because it exists in this place where, it exists in this place where, the system that created that position, still exists, but it's still an improvement on what already exists, which is the complete erasure of, history and culture and just people in general. But yeah, I think it's important for people to, learn more about this stuff, understand what's really happening. And, I definitely think it's great that you're trying to get more involved with the Muekba band and whatnot. And I think that's what more people should do as opposed to like, just looking for another nonprofit to support that they can write as a tax write-off at their end of the year when they're doing their taxes or whatnot. Because I think it's like, these are fundamentally different, organizations that are created. Ones that's done from a community of people, and the other that's done by a couple of individuals who are benefiting off of it financially, and in a number of other ways. So, I don't know.
All right. Well, we're going to keep it moving. And this next story isn't necessarily local, but it's it's kind of on the same topic of the last story, so we're going to keep it together. So this last June, I was invited to visit the Fort McDermott band, the Fort McDermott Indian Reservation. It sort of sits on the Oregon-Nevada border. I got to meet some of their organizers when I was tabling out in the Mission last February. So they put me on to their struggle up there. The communities up there are coming into conflict with a lot of mining companies because there's a massive lithium deposit up in that area. Apparently, one of the largest, if not the largest, lithium deposit in North America is right on the Oregon Nevada border, underneath a bunch of Native American reservation land. So I got the opportunity to visit them just a couple weeks ago. It was really great. I wrote about it on my Substack. This article will be linked in the description. You can check it out for a little more in-depth details. But I didn't know much about lithium mining before this. I'd seen some one-off web series about things in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The idea of haggard men, women, and children filling up dirt in little baskets so that Apple can make batteries for smartphones. But I didn't really know much beyond that. So it was great to connect with folks over in Fort McDermott. They're organized in what's known as the People of Red Mountain. To introduce them, I want to read from their website. So the People of Red Mountain, Atsakudaka Wianiu in Paiute, is a committee of traditional knowledge keepers and descendants of the Fort McDermott Paiute Shoshone Bannock tribes, working in coalition with allies to protect our ancestral homelands. We have seen the immense impact that mining projects inflict on the land, the destruction of our cultural resources, wildlife habitat, the contamination of our groundwater are unacceptable consequences of these projects. We oppose the extraction of mineral resources from our homelands because we recognize that there is no benefit great enough to outweigh the cost. While offers made by mining interests can be tempting in a small community with limited economic resources, there is nothing in the material world that can replace our clean drinking water, our first foods, or our reciprocal relationship with the land. We know that the land carries our ancestors as well as generations yet unborn. We know that what we do to the land, we do to ourselves. And so, this area right now, it's the geological feature is called the McDermott caldera. It's like this really extinct, volcanic basin that exists as part of the high desert. It's part of how it formed, like the Mesozoic. I've been looking it up. The Mesozoic era. That's when it formed. Long ass time ago. And so right now there's 6 mines planned to be built in this caldera just for lithium, right? And so looking into it, like Nevada's they're pretty deep into mining. In the state of Nevada right now, they have over 200,000 active mines in the state of Nevada. So I was looking up online. Check that up. You can Google it. And just for the state of Nevada alone, they have 180,000 abandoned mines, right? A lot, right? And so in this area, they've already experienced so much of the harm that's come from having active mines and abandoned mines. A lot of the people that I was talking to in McDermott, they really claim, they claim that their area is a cancer hotspot. They all know somebody who's gotten cancer, who's died of cancer. So, there's very much this fear that lithium mining or a new form of mining is just going to bring an even further pollution onto the area. And so, like I said before, there's 6 mines that are being planned in the McDermott caldera, and at least 2 have some kind of exploratory digging being done. So none of these lithium mines are active extracting lithium, but they're all at different levels called boreholes. So they identify there's a claim there, and they start digging down, figuring out where exactly they're going to extract. And then in order to get these different mines active, they have to get all these different phases of permits, right? And so part of the way that this works is they're supposed to involve the community, or rather, they're supposed to solicit feedback from the community about the impact of their project. And the first of these projects was fast-tracked during the COVID pandemic. What I mean by was that basically nobody was consulted. They just sent a bunch of letters out to vacant administrative buildings, something we're very familiar with. Anybody who did activism during COVID, they loved the fact that nobody was around. And then when they got no response, they were able to quickly get some of those first permits approved. And so that first project put in by Lithium Americas is like one of the most furthest along in terms of its basic exploration, even though I don't believe that they're extracting now. And so, the current administration is really big on mineral extraction. That might be news to some people. But right now, the current Trump administration is fast-tracking a lot of mineral extraction under this idea of national security. Because specifically with rare earth minerals, like lithium, they're very big in some of the competition between the U.S. and China. Because right now, China sits on some of the largest reserves of rare earth minerals, like lithium. So the U.S. desperately wants to sort of change that so they can better compete with China internationally around not just electronics, but also in that greater political sphere. And so, how does this relate to sort of Native American people? Is like, so in the United States, 97% of all nickel, 89% of copper, 79% of lithium, and 68% of cobalt reserves are all located within 35 miles of a Native American reservation, right? So as the United States accelerates its competition with the U.S. and China, it only means that these native reservations are only going to be more targeted for these different extractive mines. And with these new Trump era policies, these mining companies have even less of a burden to actually even consult local communities about it. And so, I just think that's what kind of I feel like these kind of economic ties, I think, to me, are so important as to just really just I've outlined why I think is that native sovereignty is such a key front in the anti-imperialist struggle. It's like what we see with Palestine, people struggling for a future against these brutal imperialists, But again, I think most people think of the anti-imperial struggle as just that, right? This struggle, this dire struggle halfway around the world. But I don't think they think that's happening right there in the United States, right? Palestine's also a place where they just found a bunch of oil off the coast there, off the west coast.
Yeah, when I was in New York last year, I was getting ads for trying to get people to buy into Zion oil.
Yeah,
Zionist oil.
Right. So these things are very much, there's two sides of the colonial project, right? After they end the war, they begin extraction, right? And so for a lot of the people in Fort McDermott, one of the interesting things was hearing about how the area in the Thacker Pass, it's actually, a lot of these lithium mines are, they're targeted around this area called the Thacker Pass in the McDermott caldera. And it's very interesting because it's a historic and culturally significant site for a lot of the Paiute and Shoshone people, because it specifically used to be the site of an old village that was ultimately the victim of a massacre by the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, I believe during the Modoc War or possibly the Snake War. The U.S. had a lot of different wars it was waging on Native people during the end of the 19th century. And so during one of them, the members of the 2nd Cavalry massacred, I think, at least 31 people in the Thacker Pass, men, women, and children. And so it's known as, I think in their language, it's called the Pahut Mukhun. I'm not saying that correctly. I'll correct it in post. But it means the rotten moon. So when the people found the victims of the massacre, the bodies were all just in one line. They looked like a crescent moon. So it was called the rotten moon. Right. And so part of with these lithium mines is they say that one of the threats is not just to their ecosystem, but it's also through just the basic recognition of them as survivors of a genocide, right? That this lithium mining could possibly even eliminate historical traces of this. And of course, the BLM and the government, they deny that, this genocide ever happened there. I don't believe that the United States denies that the genocide ever happened, but they specifically deny it didn't happen in this place with the lithium mines. They're very certain of it. They don't know exactly where it is, but they know it wasn't there. They're very confident of that. But so, for the people in Fort McDermott, they're kind of facing a threefold problem. There's the external attacks from the colonizers. There's the real issue of the economic underdevelopment of Native nations, and, the internal disunity of Native peoples. And I think this last one is really what the people of Red Mountain, what they've really been engaged in. And what I learned from my visit is that they've really been working to really try to bring Native peoples together through like cultural events, through different education events, through these different legal advocacy, through these different political campaigns, really just trying to create dialogue and bring people together around this issue of mining and just around this idea of a shared political and cultural heritage. And so I think, that's been very interesting to see. I got to meet some people. There's some people from visiting when the same time I was visiting from Oregon, some Klamath people there. And because they had been engaged in a similar struggle on the Oregon side against, I think it's called the Jindalee Mine Complex, is one a proposed thing that they're combating with. So they've been working to sort of bring these different bands and impacted non-Native communities together in this struggle. But I think on the issue of economic development, I think that's also an important thing because this is something that I think just faces young people broadly, right in the face. Whether you're if you're a white kid, black kid, Native American kid, there are no good jobs out there for young people, or there are not so many.
Yeah, well, it's been that way for a while.
Yeah,
and this, I definitely think with the whole promise of like building industry back in the United States, people have this idea. It's like, okay, I can finally get blue collar job. I'll get that pension. I'll get that 401k or whatever. But like most of these extractive mining jobs like aren't very secure and they're extremely dangerous.
They're dangerous. They're temporary.
Yeah. And that's on top of everything that Dayton's brought up already.
But it's also the key thing, like with a lot of these mines, is like because they have to employ so much specialized workers so quickly that they can't physically hire people from these communities.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely not.
Right, and so for a lot of these communities, for folks on reservations, these mines are sold to them as a way to develop the community. But it's a lie. These mines.
It's always a lie whenever they're like, "Oh, we'll get you a job. We'll get you a job as a fry cook as we tear your house down." It's like,
Exactly.
what? I don't want to be fry cook. Like, what the fuck?
And so these like we said, like these mines don't employ very many locals. They risk the health of the environment. But ultimately, it's like these native economies, they should be developed by native people, not just these outside companies. You just look at a good example. We're gonna go far, but if we just look at what's going on in Burkina Faso right now, you look at what Ibrahim Traore is doing. I don't know the most about his government, but I will say that he's followed some of these basic points from Thomas Sankara, in that native people should develop native economies, right? So in Burkina Faso, that means developing their agriculture without accepting foreign aid and thus foreign influence. And I think it's just this basic idea, right, like of self-reliance, that ultimately I think often Native peoples, we do understand that, we're not going to get the outside help to solve these issues. And I think that is a difficult thing. It's a difficult pill to swallow. And I think, but it's ultimately the clue that that development has to happen on our terms and the people's terms, and not the imperialists. Because we see what is development for Native Americans? Development for Native Americans is the destruction of our basic environment. It's the breakdown of our communities. It's the destruction of our ancestral way of life. Enough of that. No more. And so this is a developing story, and we'll have updates. If you want to learn more about my time at Fort McDermott, like I said, I will link an article to it in the description. I don't have any other closing thoughts, Dale.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad you went out there and have developed this connection with folks out there organizing. I think that's super important. Something that I really want to drive home is like there's a lot of different examples of these types of extractive mining processes happening domestically. I think recently there was a video documentary that was put out by Channel 5 News, written about copper mining affecting the indigenous community in Oak Flat, Arizona. I think it's called The Dark Truth About Copper Mining. I'll share a link in the video and in the description. And I mean, a lot of us remember at the end of Obama's first administration, there was the whole Standing Rock and the Keystone XL pipeline. There was a huge struggle there. And, there's been a number of times that pipeline has broken since it's been built, and we see how, even in recent years, this was like a really contentious thing for some reason. When bringing up like fracking in like Virginia and then also in like Oklahoma and a lot of these other states with these more like suburban rural communities where there aren't a lot of opportunities. But it ends up just poisoning people, and not really developing that many jobs and just ruining the environment as a whole. And so I think it's really important to just want to drive this point home that this affects everybody, even if people feel like it's like, oh, well, this is happening in some other place where it doesn't matter, like this is happening all across the United States. This happens all across the world, and it affects working class people, it affects regular people, and I think that's, people have to understand that like it's in our interest to fight back against this. We've seen historically about different times that this has happened successfully, when this has happened. Like I think about, like with the coal wars that happened in West Virginia, and the miners eventually ended up organizing, multiracial solidarity in the early 20th century at a time that was really unheard of. And we're literally fighting these private detective agencies, fighting the state, fighting these corporations. And it was some pretty intense stuff. That's why they call it the Coal Wars. It was a domestic war that happened over coal mining, and a big thing that Trump brings up is, oh yeah, like we gotta, bring back coal mining. And it's like, there aren't that many coal miners anymore. They've actually done a pretty good job of like bringing in like mechanization into that industry, but also like, no, like mining sucks. Like, let's just be real. And it's really bad for the people doing it. It's really bad for the people that lived around it. It's really bad for the environment in general. Doesn't actually do anything for the people that live in the area, and especially when we're talking about, land that should belong to people that's not the government, that are indigenous people. They should be able to determine whether or not they think it's a good idea if a corporation comes in and does this shit. Because 99% of the time, they're probably going to say no, because they realize a lot of these things. And we've seen a lot of the same stuff coming up throughout history. But yeah, and I think like it's also important to, the point that you're bringing up with like China having a monopoly, or at least like a dominant control over like rare earth minerals. I think that's really important. That's why they're looking to develop a lot more of this extraction domestically. That's why there's been a lot of struggles happening in Panama as well that we'll get into a little bit later on this podcast. But this is going to be a really big issue during this present administration, and even after, even if Trump gets elected out of office and we see another Democrat in power, whoever it might be, they're going to be doing the same stuff, whether we like it or not. And so I think it's really important for folks to recognize this is what's really happening. And just like the economics and the politics of it all are all something to be concerned with. So, yeah.
Okay. So we're going to circle back to California. So Los Angeles resists ICE. So last month, protests raged against a recent rise in publicized and aggressive ICE raids on undocumented people. People have been mobilizing around immigration courts and even disrupting ICE transport vehicles, all in a spontaneous effort to prevent ICE from ripping apart families and kidnapping their community members. So the bulk of these protests started on June 6th and escalated over the next days and managed to push Trump to directly intervene and deploy the National Guards and later over 600 Marines to quell popular resistance to ICE. So some of the reporting I looked at says that over 500 people were arrested during the protests in Los Angeles. But another figure I looked at, which is very interesting, was that in just that week alone, so far, since the beginning of June, ICE has arrested 1,600 people just in Los Angeles as a part of their ICE crackdown. Right, so it's very interesting that they arrested 500 activists and just over 1,600 just people trying to go to work. My goodness. It's crazy, crazy, crazy. So, this action by Trump to deploy the National Guard and the Marines, it's interesting because it was opposed by Governor Gavin Newsom, right? So, Donald Trump, as president, superseded the state authority of the state governor to deploy the National Guard and the Marines to quell these protests. And so I just think it's really interesting. It's just nice to see a Republican really show how much he cares about states' rights. It's just nice. Yeah, it's their thing. They just show how much they really care. And it's interesting because another interesting fact is this is the first time the Marines have been deployed to an American city in over 30 years. The last time they were deployed to an American city, it was also to Los Angeles, during the LA riots that occurred after the beating of Rodney King and the acquittal of the police officers that beat him. And so what I think is interesting is this period, this resistance is not nearly at the level of destruction seen during the LA riots. No, not nearly. Whole sections of the city were totally just leveled by a lot of that ongoing fight. And there's this level of chaos, it's not unrivaled by what's going on. So why did President Trump, why did he choose to do something so extreme then? It's I think it has to do not with the size, but with the aim of this resistance. These people had very specific aims and targets in these actions, and they directly opposed the current administration's policy. And they, to a degree, were able to prevent that policy from being implemented. And so, I think this is what the state really does not like, right? Obviously, they don't like monumentous destruction of private property, but they really don't like when you fuck with their plans, right? And so, the fact that people were able to consciously fuck with their plans, it really caused them to, call in the Marines and the National Guard. And so we saw, for our own perspective in this, we've seen smaller demonstrations and solidarity rallies in the Bay Area. I think the first night of solidarity demos in San Francisco saw about 100 people cited and released. One report that was interesting that about a man who was detained in Concord and his transportation van was stopped by activists in San Francisco on the way to the immigration court. Ultimately, the van made it through the impromptu blockade. We can clip that and share it with y'all later. It's very interesting. And I believe some of the activists were cited from there. And so it's unclear exactly how the state is dealing with the press charges on people arrested in a lot of these demonstrations, if they're actually going forward with pressing charges, or if ultimately they're dismissing these ones. Particularly, you think of instances where 500 people are arrested, if they're actually going to prosecute every single person, or just make examples of some of them. Mm-hmm. So, Dale, you were telling this one interesting story about a man who was totally documented and still ICE fucked with him.
Yeah, so there was a no-knock raid on a resident in Huntington, California. Basically, this guy got into a fender bender with an ICE vehicle, and they decided to, in retaliation, perform a joint operation between ICE, DHS, and CBP, and literally blow the front off of his house. Blow the front door open when his wife and kid were just inside. His daughter was right next to where that happened. It's pretty insane. And the guy ended up, later that day, he ended up surrendering himself to the authorities, and I'm pretty sure they released him later that day too, because, even though they were trying to play it up, it's oh, well, this guy did this intentionally, and he was trying to, mess with, a federal vehicle, which has federal charges and that sort of stuff. They didn't really have anything on him, other than he ran into a vehicle, which people get into fender benders all the time. And I think that's really indicative of how emboldened a lot of these agencies are feeling, just how law enforcement is feeling in general. Kind of a side point, recently it was the 4th of July weekend, and in the Mission District, there's always this huge fireworks celebration where there's tons of people launching off fireworks, goes well into the night. The cops showed up at 11 a.m. and cleared that shit out, and that's unheard of. 11 p.m. That's still pretty fucking early for fireworks on 4th of July.
Yeah, okay.
But that's how a lot of law enforcement is feeling right now, and I think there's a lot to learn from this present moment, despite the fact that they're feeling particularly emboldened in this moment. I think they want people to feel afraid. They had this dude shook, rightfully so. Yeah. But even so, it's if people don't take a stand, they're gonna keep doing this. They're gonna do even more, And it's I think it really comes down to people understanding we have to be able to organize, and people have to be able to work together, and there needs to be a clear political line of what we're trying to do, And I think a big issue with what we saw in the Bay was this first protest that happened It was like a few Sundays ago. Essentially, like it was an anonymous call to action. From what I heard, when people showed up, like nobody really had like a clear plan. Nobody really wanted to take leadership, and that just led to a bunch of people getting kettled. And fortunately, they were cited and released. But it's like that's why it's important for people to be able to take charge in the situation, come up with a plan to prevent a bunch of people from getting arrested, but to also make sure like not just that people are being safe, but like the reason why folks are showing out to a protest, like we're getting shit done. We're not just walking in circles. We're not just holding up signs for the sake of holding up signs, And I do think like there's a lot in this present moment that folks can learn from the BLM protests in 2020. I think like we have to be really weary of
George Floyd protests of 2020.
Fair enough. We have to be really weary of these different forces that caused, things to end up the way that they did. Like I was talking with somebody about this yesterday, The reason why a lot of things ended up the way that they did was the fact that folks who were really trying to take charge in that movement at the time were really trying to funnel people back into the Democratic Party and these NGOs. A lot of the line had to do with this idea that we would just be able to defund the police and put more money into social services, put more money into things that cause these systemic problems at the root. But the problem isn't something that can be solved within the system, And the thing that ended up happening was there weren't really any cities that actually successfully defunded the police even.
Yeah. Did
there
not
was,
even do that.
Yeah, they didn't even do that. And there's just still this narrative out there. It's like, oh, they just wanted to defund the police. It's like, actually, a lot of cops make a lot more money than they did back then.
And then it even leads to like the right-wing talking point that like the liberal left has defunded the police and left us all unsafe, which is just like,
no,
not happen.
Cops are fucking lazy, bro.
Yeah,
It's like literally, I've seen it through 2 DAs, or they're just like, no, we don't care about your car. Maybe if you give us drones, we'll use the drones because then we can still sit in our car.
Yeah, like we don't care. Like we don't care. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, anyways, I think I wanted to think of a clever segue, but I think the basic thing is that like the block is hot. It's been hot the last couple of weeks, and so what's the result of that? I think we see some interesting things pop off. One of them is these interesting No Kings protests, and I went out to the San Francisco No Kings protest on June 14th. It was very actually pretty quite a sight, to see so many people come out. The news said that about like 50,000 people were out there in the San Francisco demonstration, but it felt like way more. It felt like way more, but I don't have evidence. But I think the estimates are that I think 140,000 people went to demonstrations about the Bay Area, and almost 5 million people participated in No Kings protests around the country. So basically, pretty basically the most people come to a protest in recent memory, right? And so I think it's very clear. They're most significant in recent memory in terms of just raw numbers. But I think, we have to look deeper at the numbers if we really kind of understand the significance of these, right? So if we look at George Floyd, I think that's a good example. I remember participating in those demonstrations with like this feeling that like, oh wait, now things are different. This is like some watershed moment. All the other demonstrations after this point are going to be different now. There's just so much activity. People can't go back to brunch. And then, people immediately went back to brunch shortly after Joe Biden was elected. So I think, we need to look at these demonstrations, look for more than just the metrics. We need to see the politics underpinning these actions and what they're actually pointing toward. Because I think it should be no mystery that the No Kings protest was organized by NGOs like Indivisible, the American Civil Liberties Union, Public Citizen, the 50501 group, and all kinds of liberal nonprofit groups that are just maybe 1 or 2 steps removed from the DNC establishment. So it was not a grassroots effort. And even the same way the George Floyd protests were initially. These demonstrations were presented as being grassroots resistance against Trump, but were, intensely funded by the Democratic National Committee. Why does that matter? It matters because of what these do to the character of the protests and what they demand. I think that during George Floyd, the demand was so broad, went from reform to revolution, from simple expressions of anger, to polemics about a liberated world. But what I recall during And No Kings, it was much more flat. It was much more patriotic. Organizers literally discouraged foreign flags at the demonstration. It's so wild to be in Civic Center Plaza, and be so accustomed to seeing this place filled with Mexican, Palestinian, Lebanese flags during almost every protest the last 2 years. And then on June 14th, it just filled to the brim with U.S. flags and those little prop U.S. Constitution signs, And I think, that's not all bad, but what are these demonstrations calling for? And so my understanding is that the main line that the Dems are pushing here is only peaceful protests, rely on the courts, and vote. And apparently this is all to end fascism, right?
Also, don't forget, pay them.
Pay them, yeah. Give them money so that they can run the proper candidates. Yes. And so, can I tell, but none of these people can tell me how that's been going, And it's like, so I think we can all agree that these three things are not going to fight fascism, right? Like if this is fascism, right, the Dems are saying we all need to get our shit together, not worry about all the other shit because we got to fight fascism. Then how are peaceful protests, the courts, and voting going to fight fascism, right? It's totally ridiculous when we actually take it just like face value, right? And if we're fighting fascism, then I think we can also agree that these things, they have not historically worked. And that's a big issue, right? And so I think that goes back to so much of this liberal angle with Trump, is that these DNC types, they may hate Trump, but they're not really sure if they actually hate the things that Trump does. They're not really sure if they oppose all the wars.
I mean, some of them straight up don't. That's it's a typical Democratic Party virtue signaling. Like there are definitely at least one instance of, somebody going on Twitter, basically being like, this ICE stuff is terrible. We need to protect immigrants, and then immediately turns around and votes for the bill.
Yeah,
it's
exactly. And so, I think, Bishop is these things what they lack is they lack the basic opposition to U.S. imperialism, right? That's what the big thing. Like, why do we have no foreign flags? Well, because it's America, baby. U.S. imperialism, right? And I think that's the big thing of this DNC opposition to Trump is they oppose these things of Trump, but they don't really oppose the whole imperialism thing. They kind of do. They don't even oppose the war in Palestine. They don't. No DNC serious DNC person rep actually opposes Palestine. That's why they lost the fucking election to Trump.
Big reason why.
Yes, a big reason. I'm sorry, big reason, not the only reason, but a big reason.
Some people might try to paint it like it's the only reason, but there are bigger problems than just that.
But again, I don't think the big issue is that it's a divided thing. Because on one hand, that so many people showed up. 5 million people across this country showed up. That's a significant
that's a good amount.
thing, right? What does that mean? It means that there is a lot of energy addressing this issue. However, if it's all directed toward things that historically and empirically are proven to not actually affect the situation, then we can see it's not actually getting us to a different place, right? And so, what do? I think we just have to kind of talk about it, right? Because I think if our worst fears are correct, and I think some of them are correct, the administration is only going to do more shit that's going to piss people off. And if, the coalescence of all this mass anger is just around a lot of bullshit, well, I think we as a society have to be like, yo, let's do something different.
Yeah, definitely need to do something different. I mean, it's I think you're right about a lot of that. I think, essentially this particular protest, although it was highly successful in a lot of ways, it was, a direct byproduct of what the Dems wanted. Even though organizations that are directly affiliated and meet with the Democratic Party, like Indivisible, like Our Revolution, were shut out a couple months ago. They're still doing these protests, trying to funnel people back into this particular party. And I think a lot of people who participated in this stuff, they probably do have the mentality that it's oh, we love our freedom, we love America, we just don't like it when they do America, we like it when we do whatever the fuck that means, But also at the same time, there were a lot of people who probably showed up and it was their first time, and they were looking for some way to get active. And I think it's not a bad thing necessarily if folks are coming out for their first time and they're looking for some way to get politically active, and they're going to like the biggest thing that they see because they feel like it's the safest or whatever. But it also did really seem like it was a big coincidence to me that both of the protests that the 5501 group put on were coinciding at the same time as like other really important protests. I mean, it's like there's the one that happened a couple months ago. There was the big DC mobilization for Palestinian solidarity. When the No Kings protest happened, that was also happening the same day these mobilizations against ICE were happening. It's just down Market Street. Like you keep going there and you take a left, like you get to the ICE building where a lot of people were arrested that Sunday or whatnot. And a lot of people were showing up throughout the day, like for 2 straight days, like trying to make sure that like that people didn't go to their quote unquote court appointment, which never happens on the weekend. So they didn't get swept away and like, I don't know, put in a fucking cage somewhere or sent to like El Salvador, and I think it's like, this can only happen so many times before it stops being a coincidence. And I don't want to like dismiss people who are just engaging with some of this stuff. But I also think like, yeah, people have to realize like a lot of this, a lot of what's being presented to them isn't the solution. And they, some folks are going to have to get out of their comfort zone. Some folks just want to stay there, and that's fine. But at the same time, I think there's like a lot of young folks out there who generally don't really know what to do. And like, there's a lot of older liberal folks who are just like, oh, well, you should run for office. You should be a Democrat. You should, do all these things, and we'll support you. We'll stand for you, even if eventually you supposedly do a 180 like AOC did. You're still a Democrat, But I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, there's definitely some positives out there with this. Definitely a lot to be critical with this particular protest. But hopefully it just leads to more people being activated and being serious about like real, like grassroots, like political change,
Yeah. All right. So we're going to zoom out a little bit to some national news. So for our next story. So Zohran Mamdani wins the Democratic primary in the New York City mayoral race. Will likely be the next mayor of New York City. And so Mamdani was unique. He was a member of Democratic Socialists of America. He was a socialist candidate. But more importantly, he was the only candidate running in the Democratic primary that did not pledge his support for Israel. I think it's interesting. Before we get into that, I just really want to say just how interesting it was that like the front runner of this race before Zohran Mamdani won was Andrew Cuomo. That's just amazing. But not more so. Isn't it crazy that both Unite Here and the SEIU in New York were both endorsing Andrew Cuomo over Zohran Mamdani until he won? Yeah, total establishment. I heard a rumor they're going to switch that. They're switching that up right now. But just like, holy crap. Isn't it crazy that the front runner was a literal criminal, right? It's just so crazy that he was so far ahead in all these projected polls before his loss, right? It's just so crazy when you think of that this guy, Andrew Cuomo, he resigned his governorship of New York in disgrace. Modern charges of corruption, sexual harassment, like, holy shit, Then we see these New York City mayoral debates, and I'll be real. I didn't watch the debates. I didn't watch these debates. I didn't do any research. The only bit I looked, I saw one clip. I saw one clip where all the candidates were asked where they would visit if they got elected. Odd question to ask a mayor of a city. And all of them said Israel, except for Zohran Mamdani. And he was immediately ripped apart by the moderators and the other candidates as an anti-Semite. It's ridiculous. But it also shows how wrapped up the Israeli lobby has all of our established politicians are. They're totally wrapped up in the Israeli lobby. And so, the U.S. definitely controls Israel, but the Israel lobby definitely controls U.S. Congress. Fortunately for the American ruling class, they don't really need U.S. Congress, so AIPAC can have it. But I also think it really shows like why, grassroots efforts are so sorely needed right now, because these establishment politicians, they really don't care. They don't care enough to actually talk to people and investigate these social issues. They just throw in with a special interest group that will fund their campaign, and they're going to read their approved briefs with all the accepted talking points, and they just do a job like an actor or a DMV employee. But when people do the work to bring people together around reasonable ideas, people show up and put work in. And so Mamdani, despite all this slander, despite all this corporate backing, going to the other guy, to Andrew Cuomo, he won the Democratic primary in a blue state. This demonstrates that even most of the Democratic primary voters in the New York City are not rabid Zionists. That's positive, not that positive. When we look at the power structure in New York City, the entire establishment is vehemently Zionist, and those opposed to Zionism are not nearly as powerful and organized, even if they do make up a majority of the electorate. And so, I think this is an important thing. We need to all be looking into this and try to oppose all this Zionist slander that's going against Zohran Mamdani. But we also need to be very clear that political change is not going to come from an electoral race. Like Mamdani's still liberal, SOC Dem, liberal Dem socialist. The elections of these types of people have been a welcome change, but doesn't significantly shift things for anyone except, the people who win these offices. Obviously, everything from Mamdani's totally changed overnight, but I don't know if New York is going to change overnight or the next couple of years due to his tenure. Actually, I do know it's not going to. There's going to be some things that are going to hopefully be positive, but he's going to see a tremendous amount of pushback, and hopefully he's going to be able to finish his term. But I think it goes back to the fact it's only like an organized class that we can really use to keep these officials accountable. We can't rely on these individual personalities to stay accountable on the platform they ran on. I think you mentioned it before, Dale, but I think AOC, is such a great example. This former left-wing darling that was a part of the squad, during Trump's first term, and he's consistently flip-flop on every issue they stood for, from most glaring being Palestine. But in terms of policy issues, like things like workers' rights, she joined the majority to legalize the railroad workers' strike just a couple years ago. She sent money for weapons to Israel, and so, and apparently, and some people are talking about her as being like a presidential candidate, like people really just don't fucking get it. Or maybe they do get it, and that's just what they're okay with. That's okay too. Or it's not okay, but, I accept it. And so we have to understand this, that ultimately these liberal darlings aren't going to save us. But ultimately, you have to kind of see how they expose the system and how, like, having a grassroots campaign that has some working class elements, tries to put forward some working class politics. Let's just see how quickly this whole establishment tries to break its own rules to bury him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Just on the AOC note, I think it's really telling when somebody's like running for office or be like, you should be able to challenge politicians in public and not just let them walk away from stuff. And then when she gets challenged on, not calling it a genocide, she's like, this is harassment. And it's like, lady, you told us we could do this.
Yeah.
So don't pretend like this didn't happen before. But I mean, I think that's, you should be able to challenge politicians in public and yell at them if they do shitty stuff and go back on what they said. That's like a really basic thing. It's part of having freedom of speech, be able to speak our mind and point out when we see something that's not right. But going back to the issue at hand, I think like, the polls might say one thing, but I think like a lot of people probably underestimated just how much people in New York hate both Cuomo and hate Adams. I do think it also says something that, both parties might make a big deal about like, oh, so-and-so being a criminal, but then go out and vote for a criminal, but that's kind of neither here nor there. And I do think like someone like Mamdani getting elected is a positive development in some respects. It does show like that people can win big races by putting progressive politics on the table, which is something that, the establishment Democrats refuse to do time and time again. Even people that go in saying that they're going to change, they refuse to really put stuff out there that's, universally going to be liked by people because they realize it's a positive development. But at the same time, I do feel like this does send the wrong message to people. There are a lot of people on social media who are saying like, "Oh, he's going to lead the charge for, all these young progressive candidates to start running in the Democratic Party, and we can really change stuff this time. 7 years ago, maybe it wasn't our time, but now we can really, it's like." It's just gonna make me stir crazy if I keep hearing this sort of narrative over and over again. And there's really only two ways that it can go, where it's like either they hold their ground and they face so much opposition that they can't really get anything done, or they just turn right and then they work with everybody on whatever, and then just pretend they just bring up this very popular virtue signaling that a lot of politicians have. Let's be real, not just the Democrats, Republicans as well, where they say one thing, do the opposite. That's both parties. I just think it's important, especially because like a lot of people who support Democrats point that out with Republicans, but it's like Democrats do the same exact shit. But I think it's something, this like rightward turn that we see from like progressive darlings running for office is something that comes up time and time again from the local level to the national level. I think locally there was somebody who ran for district supervisor in the Castro, Rafael Mandelman. He had, a lot of backing from labor. He was really like running himself out there as a progressive. He was showing up to picket lines. He was like talking to all sorts of folks. He was like bringing up his story about how his like mom was homeless, and so he like empathizes with people who are homeless, and like we're gonna build a shelter in my district. And then when I get in office, a bunch of people call me and they're like, you need to call the cops on a bunch of people in tents. And then he gets pressured and he starts doing that, and he starts turning and like showing his true colors, and it turns out he wasn't a progressive, and that's like, it's like that's what we see happening time and time again. And I think like, like especially if people running an electoral campaign isn't a part of like a principled organization, it's part of like a broader plan. Like I don't really see how this like actually advances like putting like a working class politic forward. He might win some temporary gains and reforms for people who are working class. But at the same time, it doesn't build that collective power, which is really where I feel like that's where the real change happens. It doesn't just happen by people giving their power to somebody else and then just like hoping that they're going to do the best. It's not going to happen through these different legal avenues, through just like getting the right legislation with the right tax, this and that, and research and this and that. Hundreds of pages of documents, making sure everything's down to a T. That's how they want people to do it. But really what we've seen historically is the way people get shit done is they get out in the streets and they organize and they bring it to power's doorstep and they be like, you listen to us or we're going to make it a problem for you, So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think we'll see how this develops over time. I guess like on this does one last point just on this question of like, well, is this guy a socialist? Is he really not? Said he was a member of DSA. He was sponsored by them. That doesn't mean anything. Let's be real. They're an anti-socialist organization. It says so in their national bylaws, But let's just set that aside. I think something that a lot of people would agree about is, collaborating with law enforcement is not a socialist principle. As the mayor of New York, he's going to have to work with the chief of police and the captains in every district. That's just a fact. He's just going to have to do that. And he might try to push forward some reforms, and they might be positive. But at the same time, like, this dude's going to have to work with cops. He's the head of, like, the largest, like, police force in the entire nation, like one of the largest like security networks and like surveillance networks that they have anywhere in the nation. He's gonna have his finger on that stuff. And yeah, those aren't like socialist principles. So like it could go further than that, but just at the very least, like we have to be clear about these things because you can't just like suddenly show up and be like, I'm a socialist and I'm just gonna like wave my wand and not work with police anymore. So like that's literally not gonna happen. It's not how it works. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can keep moving. All right, so my notes are a little out of order.
Well, I
We
think
have the
like now we want to move more towards talking about some like international news, right?
Yes, we do.
For sure.
Just I said the Kenya story was going to be before the story on Panama.
Yeah, we can talk about Kenya.
Okay. All right, so the Kenyan protests. So 8 people have been killed and 400 injured as thousands have taken the streets in recent demonstrations in Kenya. The government's banned TV and live radio coverage of protests, but the High Court recently overturned that decision. One protester said they are protesting for the future of their kids. She feels like as a country, we're not going in the right direction, especially in education with everything happening. There's a fence around the Parliament building was covered in notes from grieving families and defiant youth, a reminder of the last years of unrest. So, Dale, what's the finance bill?
So in 2024, there was an austerity-laced finance bill that was put forward by the Prime Minister Ruto. And I think essentially it was something that was, basically like handed down from the IMF. The IMF essentially puts these countries in this position where it's like you're going to take out these loans that are impossible to actually like fulfill, and then once you default on your loan, we're going to force you to take on these austerity measures, or else you're not going to get like a halfway decent like trade agreement. Decent for the ruling class, not decent for everyday working people, obviously. And so like I do think like some of these protests are like kind of building off of in some way the protests that popped off around this last year. I think there was some some massive protests that were happening, and it's important to recognize that like one of the two of the big groups that were really trying to unite with the youth in this particular situation were the Communist Party of Kenya Marxist, and it was also the National Trade Unions Organization. Because they recognize that like the prime minister signing this finance bill would essentially put everybody in poverty, and it's one of these situations where it's like imperial powers are trying to take control over the situation, and the thing that like prevented that from really getting just rammed through was people coming up and united and just causing a ruckus.
Yeah. And so let's see here. Some things going on in some of these finance bills. So it's a series of tax reforms aimed to increase the tax to GDP ratio from 13.5% to 20%. So Kenya has the potential of a 25% tax to GDP ratio. So basically just raising the taxes, right? So basically the IMF is demanding that the government tax the people more so that they can keep up with their debt obligations. So this finance bill is supposed to allow Kenya to have its debt restructured by the IMF, right? So we'll continue to loan you money if you continue to tax the people at higher and higher levels. Awesome. So the figures I gave you at the beginning were from a demonstration on June 9th in Nairobi. But on June 25th, 1,000 more protesters gathered to commemorate the fight for the Kenyan finance bill that led to over 15 people killed and 400 more were injured. So far, 2 police officers have been arraigned over the blatant shooting of street protesters. One particular instance, the Kenyan blogger Albert Ojwang was arrested on June 6th for the false publication that criticized the deputy inspector of the general police. Ojwang was then killed in police custody due to a sustained head injury, which his death has been a lot of the impetus of these finance bills protests. Wow. Well, I just think like you see like the there's the different connections. There's a lot of different things going on in this situation, right? You have like the larger issue of austerity, right? The government is squeezing the people. They're squeezing the people at the behest of these international financial institutions. And in order to do that, they have to be incredibly brutal, right? They have to be brutal toward the people, right? Because this is their livelihood. Like imagine going from, up to 13.5% to at some point 25% tax to GDP. So gross direct domestic product, so 25% of everything you produce being taxed, right? Can you imagine that? Like what that actually means for the average person if that were to be enforced? Like if that happened to us in this society, like most people would roll over and fucking die, right? But that's just something
Or
that's,
they would actually take to the streets
or
and
they would
try and do
actually take the
something.
streets and do something, obviously, hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully, right? But this is a very serious thing, and it's being forced upon these masses of people in Kenya, without their consent, right? And then when they try to do something about it, the government fucking shoots and kills them, arrests them, beats them so bad they die, right? And so that's ultimately something that, like, they're upset and angry about, as well as the violation of their basic civil rights. They do that, right? The suppression of free speech, and the suppression of your right to assembly. And so, like, you see how, like, I think there's a lot that we can really take from this, I feel like, because I think, in some ways, like, for folks involved in a lot of the different anti-imperialist struggle, we've seen a lot of going on around the issue of, like, censorship. Folks facing censorship for their views, particularly on issues like Palestine. But even the political repression that we're seeing here in the United States is nowhere compared to around the colonized world, particularly in what's going on in Kenya right now in this story. And I think, when we think of the demonstrations in Los Angeles around ICE and the stuff around what's going on in Kenya right now, I think both of these struggles, they threaten the status quo because they're targeted at a specific policy, right? They have a particular clarity of action. And I think that's something that the powers that be, that scares people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if it's, at the end of the day, they realize that it's going to affect their everyday way of life just because it's affecting the money that goes in their pocket. And so they need to do something about it. And I think, like, the fact also that folks out there are drawing these connections to struggles that are happening here is also really important. I mean, it's like I think about, like, that's something that we see a lot, if you watch, like, international news or, like, documentaries or such. I always think about, like, the wall that they have around, I believe it's the wall that they have around either Gaza or the West Bank, just like a mural of, like, George Floyd. Like, people are aware of stuff that's happening in our country, and yet, like, at the same time, there's so many people here who don't have a clue about, like, what's happening in other places in the world, and I think it's important that folks, like, be educated and, like, try to educate themselves about this stuff. And it's difficult that we don't really see a whole lot of, like, progressive news outlets that are really trying to get into the nitty gritty about this stuff. Like, I know, like, Red Stream a couple years ago got censored on, like, Instagram. Africa Stream recently got taken down. That's messed up, because these are really important outlets that are really trying to talk about international people struggles that are happening, and these social media platforms that people are on all day, that people are sharing all this stuff about what's going on in Palestine, what's going on in Congo and Sudan. Like, they're just cutting that stuff off, and so that's why there's a need for us to dig even deeper, and us to make even more of the stuff out there, because it's like, hey, if they shut down one publication, if they shut down one more website, if we end up making half a dozen more in the process, that's a positive development in light of some not so great things happening, But yeah.
All right. That's a very interesting story. And folks can link any articles we share in the description, or they can click on any links that we share in the description for some more information. So our next international story is coming from Panama, state of emergency in the Western province. So a state of emergency was declared in Western Bocas del Toro province, where anti-government protesters are opposing a pension reform law and were accused of setting fire to a baseball stadium and of looting businesses, including the provincial airport. One interesting connection, in 2023, there was the Yellow Vest protest in France, which is a similar series of demonstrations around retirement reform. Specifically in France, they were trying to raise the retirement age for pensioners. I think the protests around that year across France drew over 800,000 to 2.3 million people. These are all protests under Macron, the current president.
People in France really know how to turn out when they're pissed.
Yeah, they really do. And also, I think the retirement age is supposed to go from 58 to 62. Fuck that.
Damn,
No.
that's nothing compared to here.
Right?
It's like when
I mean,
I
that
was,
might be totally wrong, but still, like, that's damn.
I mean, when I was younger, it was like
That's
65, and now it's like 75. But that basic means when you die. So it's like,
Yeah,
oh
work till you
god.
fucking die. But anyway, so, both people in Panama, people in France, they're not trying to deal with any of that bullshit. So, Bocas de Toro is a banana producing region, and protests culminated in clashes with police that left one person dead and 30 people, including the police, injured. It's like a ban was put in place to rescue the region from radical groups. So basically, a lot of these protests are now being banned. So there's a curfew being enforced in some of these different areas. The protests were backed by unions and indigenous groups across the country. And these protests were largely led by workers from the Chiquita banana plantation. So Chiquita called the workers' strike an unjustified abandonment of work and fired thousands of employees.
You mean the same Chiquita banana that basically created the term Banana Republic?
Yes, exactly. They're still there. They just, instead of saying United Fruit, they're now Chiquita. Chiquita. Bonita. Come on, mamacita. I'm just not going to do that. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to. So anyway, so, so folks have been doing all kinds of different demonstrations against these different pension reform laws, including so much as strikes, right? They've been actually leaving their workplaces, right? And so there's been a unity between a lot of just regular folks and organized labor, as well as organized indigenous people. And so in some places, these plantations have been on strike for more than a month. So this is part of a nationwide industrial action. So they've been protesting these new Social Security laws. They've been lowering people's pension disbursements, my understanding is. So at this point, the point of reporting, the strikes had caused at least $75 million in losses. That is according to Chiquita. And so Reuters reported that about 5,000 to 6,500 workers were just immediately laid off by Chiquita. Yeah, just immediately just laid off. And so the right-wing president, Jose Raul Molino, has been also facing protests over a deal he struck with Trump that has allowed U.S. troops to deploy to Panamanian bases along the Panama Canal. So he's been no friend of the people. And so also pushing reopening. He's also been pushing to open up some of Panama's largest mines again, the Cobra Panama.
There's more to this the soundbite that everybody will bring up, but he's like, well, he's saying that we should just let people go through the Panama Canal for free or whatever.
Yeah,
it's
right.
like, well, really, there's deeper U.S. interests that have been entwined in Panama for a long ass time, and this is really digging deeper into it, you know.
This is, again, we've talked a lot about mining in this episode already, but in Panama, I think almost half the GDP comes from copper ore, and about 2.93 billion from just copper ore, and that's only surpassed in revenue by tolls from the Panama Canal. So holy shit! So half their economy is just tolls from the Panama Canal, and they have this copper. What the hell are they doing with bananas?
Historically, the two biggest friggin' choke points in the world are the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal, because it allows you to skip entire continents and just move trade. So it makes sense that the tolls are, paying for a lot of it, but that copper part is also really important. And it's these fruit corporations exist so we can go to the store and have bananas and all these other fruits, because if they weren't interested in colonizing these different places in Central, Southern America, Hawaii, the Pacific, that sort of stuff, none of this stuff would be available or affordable.
Yeah. And so, this kind of links back to what we were talking about before with the McDermott story and around U.S. interests in sort of different minerals, right? And so, I think part of some of President Raul Molino's efforts to open this mine has really been trying to attract more foreign investment. And so, reopening this mine, it would represent probably the single largest private investment in Panama's history, $10 billion to get this mine reopened. And so. Yes. And so I'm trying to make sure that this mine is already okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's also important to note that the reason why this stuff about copper we're bringing up is a lot of this has to do with the development in new tech, and it's I'm kind of thinking about it similarly in some ways. to like how like lumber develops over time. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen like that meme where it's like, this was lumber in a house in like the 19th century or whatever, and this is what it is now. It's like the more mining that's done over time, the more extraction from the earth that happens, the lower quality of the products that come out. And that means they're going to have to double up on it even more. The need for copper in particular is going to rise a lot in the next few years. I think in one of these articles that we were looking into, the demand for copper globally is projected to increase by 70% by 2050, because copper is used in a lot of tech and a lot of microchips and a lot of these different things. And between like a third and half of global copper supply is expected to be impacted by declining ore grades and infrastructure aging as well, which is going to lead to even more production and greater capital reinvestment needs. So this question of like, rare earth minerals and like different types of like minerals and metals and stuff, it's only going to keep getting bigger, and it's really just a question of like, where are these corporations going to try to get it? They're going to try to do it here domestically. If they're unsuccessful in that, and in some ways they're probably doubly looking to invest in it internationally because they know they can develop super profits much easier. Super profits essentially being like where you're able to extract an even greater amount of profit because the expectation of like how much you even have to pay somebody or pay for certain things is even lower compared to here. But the situation here can definitely change, just like it can definitely change internationally as well. And I definitely think that like a lot of what's happening in Panama is a really positive development, and it's like these different struggles that are linking up, between like the indigenous peoples and just working class peoples in these many different sectors. I think that's really important. And that's something that we definitely see lacking here in the United States in a lot of ways. There isn't a very strong, not even like revolutionary, but like considerably like progressively minded working class movement here in the United States that's able to fight for these really important reforms against what's happening right now. And that hopefully will change over time through considerable, like organizing efforts and political education and all that. But I think that's a big reason why we wanted to highlight this particular story. Because this stuff is super important, and like you said, it's only going to keep getting bigger.
So our final story is covers a call that came out of India. It was on June 17th. The Communist Party of India, Maoist, put out an international call for a strike day. This came immediately after an international week of action in solidarity with the People's War in India in response to a recent attack and killing of several cadre and soldiers, the People's Liberation Army down there, specifically ending with the assassination of the General Secretary Dada, the CPI Maoist. And so, we actually got recent report about a solidarity vigil for some martyrs that actually was held in West Oakland. We can link some photos that we were sent. There's a solidarity vigil in West Oakland around some of the recent martyrs made in India. And I thought it was an interesting connection to be made. But before we do that, I think just talking a little bit more about what's been going on in India is that in India, there's been a pretty... I think it's been an ongoing low-intensity campaign being waged by the government against the people in India, specifically in central India amongst the Adivasi people. And that's where the CPI India Maoist is based itself, amongst the Adivasi tribal people that are often fighting much of the mineral extraction being imposed upon them by Indian and foreign international companies, all under the auspice of development, sensing a theme in today's episode. And so the people there face pretty serious oppression. The Avasi people are considered untouchables. They're on the bottom of the caste system there, and so they face a lot of different social and communal oppression due to that. They lack sufficient political and economic representation as well, and so they lack a lot of. They're deeply excluded from a lot of things in Indian society. And ultimately, their lands are quite profitable for a lot of foreign interests. And so the Indian government is very resolved to waging a brutal campaign upon them. And so one of the campaigns that's being waged for them in the last year has been known as Operation Kagar. It's an Operation Kill campaign. It's a kill campaign. So they've been using a lot of drones. Often these drones are purchased from Israel, and they use to target activists in these different tribal areas in central India. So you can imagine, green ecological forest defending activists being targeted by drone strikes, if you can imagine that. It's completely barbaric practice taken on by the Indian government on the people. And so in a recent encounter, I think the end of May and the beginning of June, like almost 30 fighters for the CPI Maoist Adivasi tribal people in central India were killed. One of them was the General Secretary, Dada. And so, our hearts go out for the martyrs in India, but I think it's important to understand that, the martyrs in India have been waging a struggle for over 40 years in some parts of India against these mining companies, against the state that's seeking to further oppress and exploit people. And, they faced countless martyrs. They have so many people have been martyred in that struggle. So many of their leaders have been martyred in this struggle, yet they continue. So I think it's a very important lesson. And so I think it was very interesting to hear that folks over here in our own local context wanted to make the connection to the Hugh P. Newton statue in West Oakland, because here in the United States, we also have a very pessimistic understanding of martyrdom, where, we often feel that our movements, particularly, I think often specifically for a lot of movements of color, specifically Black and Indigenous people, we often feel that our movements can't surpass because so many martyrs have been made. But I think when we look at the struggle in India, you see people that move on, not even I think in the face of so many of their leaders being martyred, and really see this not necessarily as such a tragedy, but as an important step that people take in the struggle. That ultimately, that by becoming martyrs, they're actually, the greatest of us.
Yeah, I think it's really important. A bunch of folks went out there to, hold an event in solidarity with folks in India, and I do think this is something that needs to be talked about more. I oftentimes bring this up where it's we don't really see a revolutionary movement here in the United States, and so, or at least a really strong one. It's pretty weak, pretty small generally, I would say. And I think so sometimes people wonder if that's possible. They might look to the past. They might not really know what to think about it, but I think it's important for people to recognize that's still happening in other parts of the world, and especially in India. I think this is their second extermination campaign. A lot of those folks have been dealing with. The first one was called Operation Green Hunt. That ended a few years ago, and then Operation Kagar began at the beginning of last year. I believe it's translation is the final step or something. It's very Nazi-esque, fascist rhetoric. But despite that, people persist. And I think it's important that people try to raise their awareness about this. Obviously, there are a lot of different communist parties in India. This is clearly one of the most militant ones and one of the most principled ones, given that they don't specifically just run elections to try and end up collaborating with the fascist government. They're actually going out there and trying to defend working class people, defend peasants, defend indigenous peoples, from these different, from the government, from these corporations, from these different fascist mobs that exist, and I think that's really not just to be commended, but to be studied and understood and to really show up for, because it's really inspiring to hear about a lot that's happening, and it's really heartbreaking to hear about when situations like these transpire, but at the end of the day, the fight goes on. I think it's what is the saying? It's like martyrs never die, and it's like the only way that it's important to not get too down, but to honor their legacy by understanding what they fought for, and then trying to take up that fight in your own way. Whether it just be like learning more about this stuff, bringing that information out there, or really like trying to get more politically involved around this stuff. There's not a really strong revolutionary movement in the United States. There's also not a really strong like Indian solidarity movement in the United States either, even though this is like one of the longest running, revolutionary movements in history,
world.
in recent memory, and it's worth people supporting, Yeah.
Yeah. All right, and I think with that, we are going to wrap up the first episode, the Rising Tide podcast. Thank you. It's been great. Okay.
Yeah, it's been fun.
All right. So, thank you so much for sticking with us to the end, y'all. Don't forget to stay connected. We're always looking for more feedback on these episodes. If there's something you want us to cover, folks, you have a difference with how we covered it, please send us a DM, give us a comment. We'll follow up. We don't have a lot going on. We can probably get back to all the feedback we get right now, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely.
Hell yeah.
Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Your feedback means a lot to us. If there's stuff you want to see us cover, please let us know. If you develop a story on your own and you want to talk about it, that would also be really cool too. We're definitely looking to connect with other folks involved in different political organizations and involved in different communities that are affected by some of the stuff that we're talking about. So any and all connections, any criticism made in good faith, we appreciate all of the above. And yeah, until next time.
All right. Signing off.
Sounding off.
Peace.
Peace.